Pardon the interruption. I'm Sam Mulberry, joined by
Annie Berglund.
Annie. We have made it to the midway point of the final unit. We are kind of in the home stretch of the course, so getting down to the very end of things.
Yes, Sam, Unit 3 flies by in just a few days. Do you have any advice for the students?
I would say you guys are doing great. I've taught this course many times over the summer, and you guys are kind of one of the best groups in terms of getting stuff turned in on time. So I would say keep up the good work. I would say as this unit comes to a close, I would just remind you to not neglect the study guide. You're doing a great job of turning in the daily assignments, but make sure you're also looking at the study guide, looking at the vocab and the essay themes. Those two things are going to help you as we get to the exam. So those would be my two big pieces of advice. Annie, we have made it into the scientific revolution. So if you had to pick just one scientific revolution reading that you think students should really try to master, which is it, and why is that answer Galileo?
I love that you gave me a false choice here, but Galileo is obviously a great answer. So one of the major changes of the scientific revolution is obviously the elevation of the scientific method. And you have gradually over centuries, science replacing religion as the source of authority. And so this rise of science and reason in the West, a lot of times one of the best readings I think that encapsulates this is the Galileo reading. So you have the medieval view of the universe, and just a little refresher, the medieval view was that the earth is the center of the universe. The rest of the universe is ordered into these perfect spheres. It all makes sense. You have the physical world versus the heavens. Everything outside of earth becomes more and more perfect as you get away from the center of the universe. And so everything in the heavens is kind of like made of an entirely different substance. And the church and kind of like the entire narrative of scripture, it's God's relationship to humans and earth. And we're at the center of scripture. So it makes sense for the church to follow along with this kind of medieval mindset of where the earth is, of how the universe works. Like, we are God's beloved creation, and he sent his son to die and reclaim us. And so having us be the center makes a lot of sense. But then you have the scientific revolution bringing in new data and experimentation and observations and these new technologies like the telescope, which obviously is very important for Galileo's observations. And you have this figure who encapsulates this tension between the source of authority of religion and this gradually shift towards science or reason as the source of authority in the public sphere. So Galileo observed imperfections on the sun and the moon, and that got him into a bit of trouble, right? We see him observing these that the heavens is matter. It's just stuff. And this was not controversial to us now, but back then this was quite controversial. This is something that the church was not happy with because God puts us at the center, and Galileo is like, there is no center. So there's this tension that develops, and we can see that in the context of the Galileo reading. And so in the Galileo reading, it's important to remember, like, he's facing trial with the church over these observations, and he's trying to defend himself, and he's not anti-religion at all in this reading. He starts out the reading, that the excerpts we have, like, saying like the Bible is clearly very important. So I actually have a quote, if I can read it, Sam. The Holy Bible can never speak untruth whenever its true meaning is understood, but it is often very difficult to understand. Hence, in expounding the Bible, if one were always to confine oneself to the literal meaning, one might fall into error. So this whole reading is built on the foundation of, let's talk about this in terms of us being Christians and of using the Bible as a source of authority, but to also say that we shouldn't ignore areas where we might need to use maybe a different perspective, right? And to say like we're critical of people who are arguing that, the Bible should be a science textbook. It's not a science textbook. And so like church leaders are really important, but they should kind of stick to their lane, right? So I think that this is ultimately a really important text for us to think about some of these big ideas, about how the church is wrong, that maybe the church has been wrong about using scripture to defend kind of antiquated beliefs on science. But also like a lot of the science that we knew and understood that was not based in the church, things like Plato and Aristotle's observations, like those were also wrong too. And we're continuing to expand our understanding of what the universe looks like. So yeah, I think Galileo is important because he exists within this transition, and the world around him is changing. And he's trying to balance his approach with like things that he is observing and noting about the universe with his very real life within the church, like his life as a Christian. Sam, if you had to pick just one scientific revolution reading that you'd want students to master, which is it, and why is it Pascal?
Well, thank you for choosing for me, like I chose for you. Pascal is one of my favorite readings that we have in this whole course. And I find him interesting because he is a scientist and mathematician and philosopher, but he is also a devout Christian. In the same way, Galileo is a Christian. He's talking from a perspective of, I acknowledge the church's authority on certain subjects, but I acknowledge science's authority on other subjects. Pascal is somebody who is coming, 50 years after Galileo. The scientific revolution is sort of further developed. And Pascal has this sense of like really what's happening. He understands the movement that's happening in the scientific revolution, and he understands that it's not just this move to say, science and reason have some good things to say, but he is really seeing science and reason raised to the fore, raised to the front. I mean, we read from Descartes as well, and Descartes is sort of arguing that, what we need to do is replace faith with reason, because faith is something that is difficult to communicate and rational things are easy to communicate. So if religion is going to exist in the marketplace of ideas, we have to elevate things on faith to the level of reason. So Pascal is responding in some ways to his fellow countrymen, right? They're both Descartes and Pascal are French theologians, or not theologians, French philosophers, French mathematicians, and French Christians. And Pascal he's trying to really carve a middle ground. He is, what I love about this reading is he is acknowledging that reason is a way of knowing, but he's also pushing the reader to say, you also have to acknowledge that faith is a way of knowing. It's not just something you believe, but he's saying it's a way of knowing. He talks a lot about the heart, and he says the heart has its reasons, which reason does not know what to make of. So he's saying we actually truly know things through our heart in the same way we know things through our mind. But it's just a different way of knowing, a different mode of knowing. But it doesn't mean that it's not knowledge. It's just a different way, because he says there are certain things that you can't know rationally, but you can feel. And he says there's big aspects of God that are that way, right? So I like that he doesn't sort of totally reject reason, but at the same time, he says we can't totally reject faith either. So I'm moved by that push to say that faith is a way of knowing. The other thing, as we get further along in that reading, he talks about the importance of knowing God, but also the importance of knowing our own misery, right? And what he's talking about there is like understanding, yes, we can use our ability to know both in the mind and the heart to know God, but he says, but that's not enough. Part of the Christian story is also our brokenness, our fallenness, our sinful nature, our need for God's grace. So that's another thing he's pointing forward to say we're going to live in a world. If you think about Enlightenment deism, that's a world where people are kind of saying, we have maybe mastered our understanding of things, and religion is less about human frailty and human fallenness, right? And Pascal is saying we can't lose sight of that part either, that maybe there are parts of us, parts of our soul that are broken and fallen and need God's grace. So I really love Pascal as somebody who in some ways can read the tea leaves as in terms of where culture is going, and he's trying to give a corrective really early on to that. So he's one of my favorite figures that we read in this course. Annie, you and I are both people who graduated with degrees in the humanities. We were both historians. And those of us in the humanities are always trying to convince people who are in the sciences, who are, students who are studying in the sciences, why it's so important that people study things like philosophy and history and things like that. But maybe let's flip that question around. Why should us humanities folks, us non-science people, non-science students, why should we be interested in fields like biology and chemistry and physics? Why should we be studying the sciences?
That's a really good question. Yeah, my gut reaction is always to think of the question on the flip side, right? Like to think, oh, like I'm making a defense for the liberal arts, or I'm making a defense specifically for history, literature, arts. Like there's studies that have shown that if you invest and engage in those disciplines, like you bolster compassion and empathy and morality. So like, of course, I want to be like, yes, those are important, but so is the sciences. And I think it's because people in different disciplines do things differently. And so if I'm only going to use a hammer on a project, I'm going to start to see everything as a nail. And so I need to start seeing solutions from different angles. I don't want to see all problems as the same, like all solutions and problems as the same way. Otherwise, I'll really miss something big. So I think people in different disciplines ask different questions. They investigate things differently. They use different methods. They publish their findings in different places. And so when we start to familiarize ourselves with all those different processes, we have a much better way of problem solving. And so that's very theoretical, but if we look at that in a specific way, I used to work at the Minnesota Senate, and my senator was in committees ranging across all different types. So she was in the education committee. She was also in local governance committees. And there were times when I, as her legislative assistant, was meant to work on proposed bills where I needed to have a crash course in like environmental science and biology when we're studying invasive species in some lake in her district. And if I wanted to understand a portion of a bill, I needed to have the language and the expertise. Obviously, I did not have that expertise, but I was able to access it from other people in the field in order to understand and process and utilize the components of the bill to present it, to make it presentable to a wide audience. And so you need both of those disciplines. You need to be able to have people collecting the data, and you also have to have people interpreting the data. And oftentimes that's multiple disciplines, it's interdisciplinary, or it's using quantitative and qualitative research together to bring something of importance to the greater public. And certainly we see that in like the time of pandemics. So that interdisciplinary work is the most fruitful kind of work. Like we need sociologists and political scientists who understand politics and social behavior and social movements to be able to assist scientists who are finding and developing a lot of like vaccines or policies to target specific groups that are in special danger, or to roll out any type of pandemic relief. Like it needs people across disciplines, right? So for someone like me who studied history and international relations, I have so much to gain from learning from science, from reading science, from taking crash courses from people who are much smarter in those fields than myself. And I think that makes me a better student of human history. Like I think it makes me a better historian, it makes me a better teacher, a better citizen, and ultimately it challenges me to see beyond my specialty and beyond my lens, and beyond my usual typical way of understanding something. So that's my case for branching out in your discipline, whether that's towards the sciences or towards literature, history, the arts. So for your last Poodle video response, we want to reflect on your own experience with science classes, which is due tomorrow at 10 a.m. So to get us started, Sam, what was your experience with science in high school and college? And did you wrestle with the relationships between science and your faith?
I would say so. I took the requisite science classes in college that I needed to graduate. I took a biology class. I took a kind of science and philosophy class as my K course. I actually did a lot more math and computer science because that was my major when I first started out in college. So I would think more about my high school experience. I went to a small Catholic high school in southern Minnesota, and we hit the sciences pretty hard. So, a full year of biology, full year of chemistry, full year of physics. And I would say that, in part because of the religious tradition that I grew up in, I didn't feel that tension between faith and science. There wasn't this sense of like science as something that was maybe dangerous or contradictory to faith, things like that. And part of that goes back to something we talked about in Unit 2, right? We talked about Thomas Aquinas and how Aquinas has this kind of high view of human reason. And that there's a lot that we can know through reason, and then that faith comes in and perfects the work that reason begins. That is that sort of Thomistic understanding of truth and reality is kind of at the core of Catholic education. So for me, those science courses felt absolutely in line with what we were talking about in our religious classes, in our religion classes, and our other classes, what we were talking about in church, that those things seemed, maybe more aligned than I think about my classmates here at Bethel's. I definitely know people who, went to schools where maybe there was a lot more tension between, like, do we even teach evolution? Do we study evolution? Or is that something that when we teach that as this is something we're going to argue against, or sort of things like that. So I personally didn't grow up with that tension, both the culture I grew up in and the schools that I went to. And definitely when I came to Bethel, I didn't feel, in the math and science courses I was taking here, I didn't feel that kind of tension. I felt like that was handled in a pretty interesting way. Now, I know a lot of our students are coming from majors in the sciences, whether they're, biokinetics, biology, chemistry, physics, math, computer science, even, neuroscience, psychology, things like that. So we're kind of interested in hearing about your experiences. Like what has that felt like both before you came to Bethel? What has that felt like at Bethel? So again, that's what we want to hear about in your Poodle response. That's due by 10 a.m. tomorrow. So go on to Moodle, record your video, and listen to each other's videos. I think that's really, really helpful and really important. I think this is a conversation that we don't always have, that I think is really, really helpful. So make sure you get on and do that. That's all the time we have for this first segment. We'll be back in segment 2 to debate some of the big issues coming out of the first half of Unit 3. Annie, welcome back. We are going to play our third round of Make the Case. So we have 3 questions that we're going to debate. I have some envelopes here with our answers, so we're going to randomly select those. Annie, do you want to read our first question?
Yes. True or false? Isaac Newton is the single most important person we talk about in this course.
I have 2 envelopes. Do you want the left or the right?
I hate this. The left.
All right, you're going to take left. We'll have you go first on this one.
Okay.
And you get to argue that the answer is...
Oh, no.
It doesn't want to come out. You get to argue false. Isaac Newton is not the most important person.
Wow. Okay. It always feels a little strange arguing false first, but I'm going to do it. So here's my reason. Obviously, I know you're going to talk about all the reasons why Isaac Newton is incredibly important, like a paradigm shift in history, right? Like the entire way we view the world and everything around us hinges on his laws of nature and the law of gravity, right? So like clearly a very important Enlightenment, kicking off the Enlightenment. So he's an important scientific revolution thinker as well as an Enlightenment individual too. And so I think I would say, if we're looking at this a little bit wider, I would say, yes, he is clearly very important, but there are voices out there that push against some of these Enlightenment ideals and shifts, saying they aren't really meeting the ideals that they have, or perhaps they are missing certain groups of people. So I'm going to look at an individual that we study in this class who challenges Enlightenment thinkers and folks coming out of the scientific revolution and Enlightenment. So that individual is Eludo Equiano. And Eludo Equiano, along with Wollstonecraft, is one of those voices that we hear that pushes against issues of natural rights in the Enlightenment. So he writes a memoir of being freed or captured in Africa. He goes on the Middle Passage. He buys his own freedom. And he appeals to both religion and to reason. So some of those questions that are lingering and continue to this day from the scientific revolution, when we have reason elevated to the level of religion or perhaps above religion, we need to be able to reconcile some of our actions and behaviors based both on religion and reason. And so he does this to explain why enslaving human beings is wrong. And he says slavery deprives enslaved people of their virtue, but it also degrades slave owners. And so it forces slaves into a life to live at war with their slave owner, but it also holds slave owners responsible for horrors that slavery causes. And I would argue not even slave owners, but people who are complicit in even less direct ways. So a key takeaway of the Enlightenment at this time is we have this developing notion of individual rights, but it's rights for a certain group of people, right? So the theories of John Locke and others like him, these political theorists in the Enlightenment, aid democratic revolutions, but there are many changes, but also not so many changes too. So you have social revolutions and democratic revolutions, and they all occur among and for elites. You have landholders, men, usually white men, right? And so race and slavery develop at the same time as a way to justify, like these terms of race, the term of race, and then also the institution of slavery develop as a response for Europeans justifying that they are rational beings and they can take over and force others into their submission. And so I think while Isaac Newton is incredibly important for shifting our perspective of science, I'm going to say I would argue Equiano is the most important person that we can study in Unit 3, because I think he really helps us bridge that scientific revolution and Enlightenment into today. So his book helped to contribute to the British Slave Trade Act, became a bestseller despite being written by somebody who many people, pun not intended, wrote off, right? Somebody who did not have the same level of humanity by elites, by landowners, and also just by most white people. So it's immensely important for social historians and that progress towards making Enlightenment ideals actually reach everyone, not just a specific group. So I would argue Equiano is the most important person. Sam, why is Isaac Newton the single most important person?
Well, you put me in a tough spot because you're making me argue against Equiano. Like you've sort of shifted the tables instead of it being why is Newton important. It's like you're trying to bait me into saying why Equiano's not important, and I'm not going to take that bait. I'm going to talk about Isaac Newton. Students, you're going to read a lot more and hear a lot more about Equiano tomorrow. So that was a really good sort of primer on where we're headed with this. Why I think Newton is so important. You keep using this phrase paradigm shift, right? That he shifts things, he changes things. And that's true. I mean, a paradigm shift is what that literally means is a fundamental shift in terms of how we look at the world, a shift in worldview. I would argue that is true, but I would go even further with that, which is I think, especially all of us who are living, a solid, 400 years later, right? Well, not quite 400, 300 and some years later, that he not only shifts the worldview, I think he shapes the Western mind. And what I mean by that is that as we get this move to this scientific worldview, to this mechanistic view of the world. Because what Newton does when he gives us this law of gravity, he gives us a small mathematical equation that describes how everything that has matter works. It describes all of it, right? It changes the way we think about how the world around us works. In the Middle Ages, remember in the Middle Ages, we talked about this veil between this world and the next. We talk about this sort of haunted world in that way. The world is this like living organism whose beating heart is God. After Newton publishes his Principia in 1687, all of a sudden now the world is a rational machine that runs on these laws of nature. So he's important because of that. He's also important because he sets the trajectory for really everything that comes after it, right? Once you have that mechanistic worldview, it changes the questions you ask. Because if you believe the world is a rational machine, then all of a sudden what we study ends up becoming, how does that machine work? How can we understand that machine? How can we learn its laws, its rules? How can we harness that machine, right? So the Enlightenment project all grows out of Newton. The Industrial Revolution grows out of this combination of Enlightenment views of progress and Enlightenment's attempts to sort of harness this world of reason and scientific and technological advances. So we're living in this sort of post-industrial world, but a highly technological world. So he shapes that. Now, I want to go back to what I said in terms of he also shapes our minds. We're both historians, right? We talk about studying history as like this, it's almost like time travel, like we're trying to take these trips to this foreign country that is the past, right? And we try to understand the culture and learn about it and try to put ourselves in the shoes of the people that we're studying. You use the word empathy when you were talking about studying the humanities, right? Like that's what we try to do. Newton, in some ways, has severed the ties with those people who come before us. I love someone like Hildegard of Bingen. I love someone like Perpetua. I love to read from them and try to understand their worldview. But the truth of the matter is, Annie, like we can only pretend to understand what a medieval person is like, what an ancient person is like, because our minds are shaped by Newton, shaped by this scientific worldview. So to say that he shifts things, I mean, you say that almost dismissively, like he moves us from here to here. He moves us from this view of the world to this view of the world, right? Like it is an absolute 180 in terms of how we think about things. I just don't think anybody else in this course has that kind of almost immediate impact. So I think he's unbelievably important. Our second question, Annie, Pascal wants to know, which is a more important problem for Christians in a scientific age? And I would argue even in the age we live in, to submit everything to reason or to offend the principles of reason. Pascal says these are two things we need to avoid. Which is worse? I have two envelopes here. I'll go first this time.
Okay, but I choose.
You can choose. Yeah.
Right.
All right, you're going to get the right, so I will take the left.
Yeah.
So my answer is that it is more dangerous to submit everything to reason. Now, here's why I think that's the most important, because I think this is the temptation of a scientific world. Everything I just said about this just dovetails perfectly into what I was talking about before, right? If we think of the world as this rational machine that we can understand, and we think about the world as something that if we can understand it, we can articulate it, we can harness it, we can use it, reason becomes the currency of our culture, of our intellectual culture. In the marketplace of ideas, reason is the thing that has value, right? And this is exactly what Descartes says. Descartes says, like, in a world where reason is the currency of the marketplace of ideas, how could a person of faith ever talk to what he calls the infidel, just the person without faith? How could you ever talk about faith to somebody who doesn't already have faith, because they would just be like, well, it's great that you believe that, right? But like, how could you ever talk about, how could you ever convince somebody of the realities of religion unless you convince them by arguments of reason? Okay, so this is what Descartes tries to do, right? Tries to say, can I establish that God exists, that the soul is immortal and lives on, beyond the body? Can I convince people rationally of that? Can I build a rational foundation under all my religious beliefs? That's the temptation of a scientific world, of a world that values reason as its currency. Now, the problem with that is that if we do that, and Descartes is successful, if you read Meditations on First Philosophy, he successfully strips everything he believes away down to the only belief is that I doubt, and if I doubt, I think, and if I think, I exist. And he builds this rational foundation up from I exist to God exists. I exist, and the soul is immortal. He manages to make those rational arguments. Now, the problem is, as he makes those arguments, there are things about his old view of God, that was based on faith, that don't fit into the shape or the category of reason. So those things don't get built back into God, right? And so you end up having a God that is limited by the understanding of reason, by the boundaries of reason. So you end up, as Pascal would say, you end up killing the very thing you're trying to save, right? You're trying to save religion, you're trying to save God, but by bounding it by reason, you've stripped it away of any real power that it has. So I think this idea that everything needs to be submitted to reason is one of the biggest dangers to religion, because religion is both rational and transrational. It goes beyond anything we can understand rationally. And at the same time, it is because God it is the basis for reason and rationality. Where does human reason come from? It comes from God. So it encapsulates human reason, but it also goes far beyond that and transcends that. Annie, why do you think that the biggest problem is to offend the principles of reason?
Right. I think that I love your answer, and it does seem like it's a slippery slope in either direction, right? And that's why it's such a tricky idea. It's such a tricky question. Someone like Pascal is such a Bethel figure. He's someone he's brilliant. And he also has this deep, like, intimate relationship with God that you can read in his writing. And it's like heartfelt. Like, I think we've described it in this class before as nearing like mystical. And so he combines aspects of Christianity as rigorously intellectual. And so it's not just personal, though, it is intellectual. And us as human beings, we have this, we need to, as Christians, we need to pursue this both in a rational and in a supernatural perspective. And so I like that he stands in that middle area. And I agree with you, but I think offending the principles of reason can be tricky and slippery as well. And so if we prioritize faith over the principles of reason, it's kind of a twofold issue. The first issue is that makes it difficult to proselytize. Like, I don't love that word, but it does make it difficult for us to express our worldview, to express our mindset to people who aren't Christians, if we are unwilling to make it a little, to see it in the eyes of reason, to see it through a lens that is rational. But I also think that it can be an issue for ourselves. And so if we shy away from reason, if we're willing to prioritize faith in more and more ways over reason, over the principles of reason, I think that what I've seen happen in my relationships with other Christians, certainly what I've seen happen or I've heard of happen is that you kind of create a fear of reason or a fear of science. And so, I mean, this is like the age-old question with Christianity. As soon as it came into the field, like how much do we elevate certain sources of authority? And so I think if we shy away or start to fear scientific discovery or start to fear the principles of reason. We might be less willing to see ethical dilemmas from multiple perspectives, to maybe to find any flexibility in our understandings of the world around us, and instead might approach topics that are with a rigidity, with an unwillingness to see it from a different perspective. And certainly when we interpret scripture, there are many interpretations of many portions of scripture. And so it's important for us to realize, like, if we view faith as the end all say all, well, what does that actually mean? And it can mean very different things to very different people. So I think it's important that we also elevate reason as well, and we try to have that middle path. I think that is not only an issue for those who we are trying to win over to the faith of spreading the good news of Christianity, but it's also important for us as well.
Absolutely. Last question. Emmanuel Kant wants to know, what's the bigger obstacle to enlightenment? Is it cowardice or is it laziness? You're going to go first on this one. Which envelope do you want?
Oh, right.
All right. You're going to take the right hand. So you are going to argue that the biggest obstacle to human enlightenment is cowardice.
Ooh, okay. And I'm going first.
Yes.
Okay. Challenging long-standing beliefs takes courage. Being able to question authority takes courage. Sometimes it means facing hardship or facing punishment. And I think we have that phrase, like ignorance is bliss. It's more comfortable, right? But this attitude of the Enlightenment is that we are not seeking comfort. And instead, we are running away from ease. And we have to address things that have become comfortable for us for decades or centuries. And we have to face this intellectual discomfort. And so if we think about this in like the whole course idea, we have a really important reading from the start of class, which is Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And in this reading, just a refresher, when you are unshackled, you head out of the cave and you realize that those shadows and puppets that were around you are nothing compared to like the real truth of the world around you, of these ideal forms, right? And what happens when you step out of the cave? You are blinded. And you're experiencing this thing we call cognitive dissonance. And it's deeply uncomfortable. But when you are willing to take the courage to go into areas where you question everything that, or even just one thing that you had held as true, without error, when you're willing to start challenging some of these things that you have believed perhaps blindly, I think you become truly a better person. And I think that that's the Enlightenment ideal, right? Like, if we are willing to take that first step, and willing to say, perhaps I'm not right on this topic and I need to shift my understanding, that takes courage, right? Like, you can run back to the cave and you can avoid the dissonance and the tension and discomfort and go back to the things that you understand, or you can stand in the discomfort and like begin to rework and reimagine your misunderstandings and relearn or unlearn things that you've always held as true, even if they weren't true. So I think that cowardice is the biggest obstacle, because courage is the first step. And courage is what brings us out of the cave and what emancipates us. It makes us address our inaccuracies and our misunderstandings. And it leads us on this eventual path to working towards change, which I think then is when laziness comes into place, right? So I think that the first step is really the step of courage, and maybe laziness is the step that continues us on that path towards enlightenment.
Right. So I am arguing laziness.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear everything that you're saying, and these two impulses work hand in hand. And in fact, I think it's interesting because Kant is maybe not going to, as a sort of Enlightenment person, is not going to talk in terms of the categories of human fallenness and human sinfulness, but he is hitting on something here, because this is one of the issues of the Enlightenment, is that we can say reason is this powerful thing and reason can explain everything. But it's like, Kant is writing at the end of the 1700s after a century, a full century after Newton, and he's saying, well, why are we not enlightened? And ultimately, he's kind of pointing to human fallenness and human sinfulness. And he says, we're cowards, we're lazy, right? So why laziness? Why is that such a big impediment to enlightenment? And it's because everything that you're talking about, it takes courage to take that first step. But more importantly, even after you take that first step, it takes a lot of work, right? It takes a lot of work to come to real conclusions. More importantly, it takes a lot of, at one level, it's not hard to be like, well, okay, I'm just like, ask me any question, I'll just give you an opinion on it. It's like, okay, well, let's say that's not a lot of work, but it does take a lot of work to step into this phrase that I keep saying, to step into the marketplace of ideas with your wholly self-owned takes, views on things, and be able to make a case for it, right? That takes work to be able to do that. It takes work. Think about students when you come to something, you come to Bethel. Maybe you grew up in a family that was you grew up in a Christian home, and you kind of inherited the faith of your family, the faith of your parents and your grandparents and your community. That's true for a lot of people. It takes work to make that faith your own, to say, okay, here is what I inherited. And even if I'm brave enough to say I am going to, be willing to question what I inherited, it takes work to come to your own conclusions, to come to conclusions that you can stand behind. And here's the other part about laziness. We are surrounded by temptation that feeds into our laziness. We're surrounded by people who are willing to answer those questions for us. And we sit here and we realize, and this comes right out of Kant, he says it's so much easier to just look to experts around me and have them tell me what to think. Because then I don't have to do the work. I don't have to really answer those questions. I can say, well, this person seems smart. They seem like they've thought through it. I'm just going to take their view of this, and I'm going to listen to this person and do what they say about this and not that it's that looking to experts is bad and wrong. I mean, you go to a university to study from people who have studied things, but my hope is you don't merely just absorb things and say, okay, well, now that's what I'm going to say about this. But hopefully we're here to think about these things. Hopefully in a course like CWC, you're not just, reading the readings, but you're reading the readings and thinking about them. You read from Luther and Erasmus and Galileo and Pascal and Descartes, and you say, okay, and I've put the work in to understand what this person's saying. Now, what do I think about that idea now that I understand it? That's work both to understand the idea, and it's work to then evaluate the idea. And it is a lot easier to just say, I'm just going to who seems like the smart person in the room, I'm going to agree with them. That's way easier. I think that's very, very human. I think it's something that we are all guilty of. I definitely know that I'm guilty of that. It is easier to just look to somebody else to guide me towards answers or to give me answers to things rather than put that work in. And so I think where it takes courage to step out on your own, I think it takes work to maintain those views, to develop and maintain those views. So I think that's actually the bigger impediment. Students, we talked about thinking for yourself. You've listened to us talk through these ideas. Now it's time for you to take to do the work and to have courage to go plant your flag in the ground. Go on to Moodle. You get to vote who you think won each of these debates. Annie, you've sort of crushed me at all of the competitions this summer. So
I like these students.
yeah, they clearly like your views on things, because I never seem to be able to crack into the winner's circle on this. But hopefully Unit 3 is going to be my unit. So go on to Moodle, vote for who you think won each debate. We will be back in a few seconds to wrap up the show.
And welcome back to Happy Happy Time. Happy birthday to Benedict Cumberbatch. The English actor turns 46 years old today. Sam, what is your favorite Cumberbatch performance? Is it Sherlock? Is it Doctor Strange? Is it something else?
It was sort of interesting. So for one thing, I realized I am just a year younger than Benedict Cumberbatch. So I didn't. That's always strange to sort of feel your age that way. I kind of went through his filmography to answer this question. I was surprised how many things he's been in. He seems ubiquitous to me, but how many things he's been in that I haven't seen or who that didn't leave a major mark on me. I think Doctor Strange and Sherlock are the two like iconic performances. They're definitely things that he's played a lot. I'm not a huge like Marvel comic book movie fan, so I've actually only seen him as Doctor Strange in Endgame, I think. Endgame, Infinity War. I don't so probably not going to pick that. I do like him as Sherlock. But I'm going to say that the performance I liked him most in was as Phil Burbank in 2021's Power of the Dog. He was nominated for an Oscar for Best Actor for that movie. It's a Jane Campion movie. It's on Netflix. Really great movie. So that's going to be my pick for my favorite Benedict Cumberbatch performance. Annie, happy anniversary to the Seneca Falls Convention. The 2-day women's rights convention opened on this day in 1848. Annie, if you could jump into your DeLorean and go back in time to attend the conference, which two attendees would you want to have lunch with?
I love this question. My gut reaction was obviously Elizabeth Cady Stanton as like kind of the woman to talk to, but I think I'm going to come up with a different one. So first, I think it would be fun or perhaps even more interesting to talk to kind of like a miscellaneous woman attendee, like somebody who didn't really like make the history books, but like was there, and just to see what they've done, what their experiences were, why they're there. Are there things that they disagree with and yet they still showed up? Like
you could write a great book about that person because
right?
Nobody else would. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Right. So that was one, like miscellaneous woman in the crowd. And then my other was Frederick Douglass, who attended famously as the only African-American attendee. And that's not the only African-American male attendee. That's the only African-American attendee. And I think that is a stain on the feminist movement for sure, to have such a big event and many events for centuries and to exclude many important portions of society. And so I think it would be interesting to have lunch with him, not only to just talk about, who he is and like in his own right and all of the things that he stood for, but also his views on women's rights as an African-American man. So those are my choices. All right. Happy trails to Petrarch, the father of Renaissance humanism, died in 1374. Sam, traditionally students forget about Petrarch in CWC. Why is that, and why should they care about him?
Well, Petrarch is there at the beginning of the Renaissance, so I think people like to move on to like the high Renaissance folks. They like their Michelangelos, their Da Vinci's, their Raphaels, all the Ninja Turtles, like that, Petrarch didn't get to be a Ninja Turtle, so that's probably why he gets forgotten. But I think he's such a fascinating figure because in CWC we're fond of talking about hinge figures, people who are alive at these unique moments in time when times are changing. So he's alive. His life spans most of that 14th century, that century of crisis, but he's also the father of the Renaissance. He's the one who coins that phrase ad fontes and popularizes that idea of going back to the sources. So I think he's really, really important. But unfortunately, whenever I teach this course and I bring up Petrarch, I get a lot of blank looks from students. Now, not students this summer. You guys know your Petrarch, but other semesters when I've taught CWC, Petrarch seems to get lost in the shuffle a little bit. Annie, that is all the time that we have. Students, remember to go on to Moodle and vote for who won Make the Case. More importantly, go on to Moodle and do your Poodle response for tomorrow. It's due by 10 a.m. Tell us about your experiences in the sciences, in high school, in college, and especially, your views on or what you've experienced in terms of the potential relationship and or tensions between faith and science. So those, again, are due by 10 a.m. tomorrow. That's all the time that we have. Thanks for watching, and we will be back with one more webisode before this summer's over. Say goodnight, Stacy.